Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight here at the State Library, Victoria. It is a really exciting night to shine a light on someone who I think is so important in this country. She is obviously a garden designer, a renowned author, photographer, and I think an Australian icon, Edna Walling. And this crowd really says to me that you might think that as well. Hello to all of those who are joining us on the live stream as well. This is being streamed on the library YouTube channel and will be available later for people to view. So my name is Millie Ross and I'm a gardener, but I'm also just a lifelong lover of growing things, of making things, and of then sharing my passions with other people in the hope that that can encourage their own. And I think that Edna Walling really, in all of those fields, was a leading light in this country. So I'm exceedingly pleased to be here with you tonight. Before we begin, I need to do something on behalf of the State Library. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands of all of the Victorian Aboriginal clans and their cultural practices and knowledge systems. The library recognises that the state collection hold traditional cultural knowledge belonging to Indigenous communities in Victoria and around the country. They support those communities to protect the integrity of this information gathered from their ancestors throughout the colonial period. They pay respects to their elders, past and present, who have handed down these systems of practice to each new generation for millennia. Personally, I've come here from Tangarong country, and I personally also offer my deepest respect and my personal gratitude for the continued leadership and generosity of our First Nations peoples. When I was thinking about that acknowledgement and having to read an acknowledgement from a state institution, I thought about how Edna might feel about that. I think that she would hear an acknowledgement of country, the embedding of place in an event, and of the landscape and the deep knowledge it holds as an incredibly exciting thing, and she would be incredibly eager to learn more. Edna's enthusiasm for place and influence over the Australian garden cannot be overstated. If you walk through a garden with low stone walls, there's mossy boulders, meandering paths that you just have to explore, leafy, wild and emotive plantings, or just a towering lemon-scented gum, it was probably influenced by Edna. She inspired so many of us, indirectly through her writing and directly through her work. She was a pioneer, of course, in design, with notable clients: Dame Nellie Melba, a friend, Dame Murdoch. Am I in trouble already? But her powerful influence can still be observed in many of the best plant minds and landscape design practitioners working today. At a time when women were expected to remain at home, Walling cultivated her own path. At 26, she set out to hand-build her own house, stone cottage called Sonning. It was the seed of Bickley Vale, which was her English-style garden and village development. It had wild plant-filled gardens. It had gates that connected the gardens and the community. It was well before its time, and of course it remains now, still protected with heritage protection for people to still view. It is open regularly with the Open Garden Scheme. We'll come back to that later. Edna Walling was also a prolific writer. Her understanding of the power of a word was remarkable. She contributed hundreds of articles to Australian Home Beautiful magazine and published 4 books during her lifetime. We have many of them on display today. A 5th was published after she died. She was also an incredible photographer, always in black and white. And she captured images of her gardens, but also of the natural Australian landscape. and she was a really fierce and early advocate for the conservation of Australian landscapes and, of course, for the use of our wonderful plants in landscapes. Something, again, which I think is so important today. Now, the State Library holds around 4,500 of Edna Walling's photographs, around 300 hand-drawn watercolour designs, and numerous manuscripts and articles. And tonight we've got a special display of items that have been curated by the library staff members. Senior Conservator Marika, I knew how to pronounce it, Marika Kocic, and Senior Collection Curator Sara and Ryan. And following the discussion tonight, we're going to stay around and we can all have a really good look at those items and ask them lots of questions, which I already have. So I'd like to welcome Marika and Sara to the stage. They're going to give you a little bit of an introduction into what we have on display and, of course, talk about how the State Library actually cares for it. So welcome them both, please.
Good evening. It's lovely to be with you. Well, in addition to being one of Australia's most prominent garden designers, Edna Walling was also an accomplished writer and photographer, as Millie has mentioned. We're fortunate at State Library Victoria to hold extensive examples of her work in all these areas and are thrilled to be able to share some of them with you tonight. Her garden plans were produced as either diazo photo prints, negative dye lines, or ink and watercolour drawings, such as this one here. Sorry, we're just having some problems with the slides. Nice portrait of Edna. Okay. So this is an example of one of her beautiful watercolours. She often provided presentation copies of her plans to her clients, and of the 300 or so plans held by the library, about 30 feature watercolour. Works of art in their own right that bring her ideas to life with vibrancy. One of Walling's best-known gardens is Urrumbine in Beaufort, Victoria, where she designed a formal terrace around an existing pool. Always taking advantage of anything unusual about a site, her plans of Urrumbine exemplify her mastery of challenging landscapes on a slope. Architectural elements like interlocking stone walls, terraces and pergolas are used to accentuate changing levels to great effect. One of Walling's high-profile clients, Dame Nellie Melba, she actually designed a water lily garden for her at the famous Sopranos residence at Coombe Cottage, Coldstream. But it was never realised because Melba thought the cost too exorbitant. Plans are the only documentation that remains of some Walling gardens. Many have been erased by developments or subdivisions, or because people were unaware they owned a garden designed by Walling. Walling won many dedicated followers through her regular long-standing column about garden design in the Australian Home Beautiful from 1925 through to 1950. She inspired the masses to create a little Edna for their gardens. Personal in style, her column made her readers feel as though she was speaking directly to them. She characteristically signed off with the tagline, "Yours deciduously." Garden design alone didn't earn Walling enough money to make a living, but writing magazine articles provided her with a much-needed regular income. She published 3 books on garden design in her lifetime: Gardens in Australia, Their Design and Care in 1943, Cottage and Garden in Australia in 1947, and A Gardener's Log in 1948. Walling travelled extensively around Australia, documenting the landscape and the flora and fauna she encountered. In 1952, she published a 4th book titled The Australian Roadside. It records roadside plantings, the effects of erosion, and staunchly advocates for conservation of the natural landscape. Walling was a keen photographer with an eye for skillful and sensitive composition of images. The library holds close to 5,000 of her photographs. Many were published in her books and numerous articles in journals, including the Australian Home Beautiful. A local source of inspiration for her photography was the first home she built for herself in Mooroolbark called Sonning, named after a garden designed by British horticulturalist Gertrude Jekyll, who was a major influence. Sonning was the heart of Bickley Vale, the village Walling created and modelled on the Devonshire villages of her childhood. She favoured black and white film and developed photos in her own darkroom. Her subjects included portraits of people, animals, plants, views of various gardens that she designed, and landscapes from her travels around Australia. I'll now pass you over to my colleague, Marika.
Thanks, Sarah. Good evening, everyone. My role as a Senior Conservator of Paper sits within the collection care in collections. We are responsible for the preservation and conservation treatment programs and preventative conservation, archival storage and rehousing, preparation for digitisation and exhibitions including mount cutting and framing, and the management of the inward and outward loans programs. We constantly strive to develop a deep understanding of the physical and chemical properties of materials within our care, and in collaboration we investigate the materials and techniques used to create these items. For this evening, I've selected some of Edna Walling's watercolour plans to illustrate some of the things we look for and what we are sometimes presented with. Here we can see a plan in normal light, and now in raking light. And for those of you that aren't familiar, raking light uses illumination from a light source almost parallel to the surface, providing information on the surface topography. The vertical creases, I've been shown this laser, I'm going to try and use it. There we go. So the vertical creases that you can see here and the distortions across the surface suggest that this was once rolled and extensively handled, which kind of makes sense for a working drawing. Interestingly, we can also see that this paper, which looks quite smooth in the left image, has in fact got quite a surface texture to it, which makes sense for paper that's been developed for watercolour use. Watermarks are sometimes present, and here we see a partial watermark JW representing Watman's, an English paper mill that was established in the mid-18th century, and surprisingly they actually made watercolour paper. We see many annotations, some we can easily read, like this one, which makes mention of stepping stones through the water, with others can be sometimes slightly more challenging. As a paper conservator, we tend to always be looking at the backs of works, so it's been really lovely with this collection to be looking quite interestingly at the front of all her works. Discoloration and staining can present a bit of a problem, but part of our decision making when considering a treatment is whether the reduction or removal of stains is actually necessary. What is that stain composed of? Is it part of its story? Does it affect the reading of the object? And so on and so forth. And tears. These may be small and simple or large and complex and may affect the safe handling or display of the works, thus impacting their accessibility. We see a lot of tears come across our benches, some with quite creative and extensive repair methods as well. And I must admit that sticky tape is definitely not one of our favourites. That's just a warning to all of you out there. Put it away, please. Risk assessments and ethical and cultural considerations are also embedded in our treatment proposals before committing to a treatment. Our aim is always to undertake best practice, which means that sometimes we need to revisit past treatments when new techniques or materials become available to us. And this is why it is important for reversibility in many of the things that we do. My final slide is of a treatment that is currently in progress. And here we see the front of a watercolour plan that has been executed on tracing paper. Tracing paper and moisture don't really go hand in hand. They don't really like each other. And it's got quite a few tears throughout it. Due to the translucency of this type of paper, we can actually see the repairs that have been put on the back. So can you see all these little lines and this great big loss over here? So this is the front of the work, but the repairs have actually been applied to the back. But because of this translucency, we can actually see it on the front of the work, and it kind of just disturbs the eye just a tad. So here is a detail of the back of the work, and it's just from this little tiny area. This is the yellow down there, up here. And these repairs were completed about 20 years ago. They are still reversible, and in fact, we still use this method on paper supports today. However, with new research into the repair of tracing paper, this has enabled us to remove and replace, here we go, these old repairs with new ones, still using a Japanese tissue, although a lot lighter, and this time with a different adhesive, which that does not require moisture. And so this actually really has got a repair in here, so it's a pretty good outcome, I think anyway. So I'm going to stop right here, and I'll hand you back over. Thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Marika and Sara. How many questions do we have? Should we just open up the floor? I love the idea of these plans, which are so cared for now, but I can imagine they were rolled out over a rock, you know, to explain a design to a client, or, you know, knowing that Edna lived fully, that they no doubt lived a life. Before we get started proper, I just want to do some housekeeping, which is important. Please, if you haven't already, switch off your mobile phone. And those on the live stream, I'm going to recommend you put it in another room. Just, you know, it's too easy to get distracted, but that would be really appreciated. If you need to use a bathroom, there is one just outside this door. Yeah, that's a different direction. Okay, that one is not open. This one is open. And we're not going to do question and answer at the end of the session today, just because we've got not enough time and we know you're going to want to look at the work. So when we wrap up the discussion, please do stick around, have a chat, and come and speak to the staff here to learn a little bit more about what we're doing. Now comes the awkward moment where I decide whether I introduce my guest speakers, but I think I'll probably come over here and be a bit different. I need to now introduce the panel to you. I'm thrilled that they can both join me. Trisha Dixon, who is a writer and a photographer. She has a passion for landscape, literature, music, art, architecture, design and history. And she's a really experienced tour leader. She's visited many of these gardens, I know, here in Australia and abroad. She has a number of books to her name, including 2 co-authored specifically with Jenny Churchill on the life and designs of Edna Walling. Please join me, Trisha. Come and find a seat.
Thank you, Millie.
Also joining today, I know there's a copy of Trisha's book over there I think someone else has to turn the pages for you in a library, don't they, wearing white gloves. You can't look at it yourself. Sara Hardy, a biographer, playwright and former actor. She was born in Devon in England, where she performed various theatre roles in London before arriving in Australia. And she was inspired to write her first biography, The Unusual Life of Edna Walling, after portraying Edna Walling in an outdoor theatre performance in Melbourne. She's literally walked in her shoes. Sara's most recent publication is A Secretive Life, a novel that explores the LGBTQ+ underworld of the 20th century, where Edna Walling makes a cameo appearance. Please welcome Sara to the stage. I'm going to have to organise my first edition of the Australian Roadside here, but, you know, the conservation book. I think, look, there's a room full of really different faces, which I'm super excited to speak to everyone after this session to learn why they're here. But I guess it would be remiss of me not to start out asking you why you were both here. I mean, it's nearly 50 years after Edna passed, yet we're still here talking about her work. Trisha, what is it that drew you to Edna Walling, and what has kept you with her?
So I grew up in a country garden in New South Wales, and my mother had the Edna Walling books, and her brother lived next door to Edna Walling Garden, Markdale. My great aunt had Edna Walling to stay, and so we kind of grew up with that lovely thing, and they were always bushwalking. We're always walking down gorges and coming back with stones, and Dad was always making these curved stone walls or just stone, steps or whatever. So very much a garden in the Edna Walling style. Then I had 9 years in a school, and the headmistress of that school could have been Edna Walling's sister, because when I went around every single Edna Walling garden, extant garden, when I went back to the school, I went, this is more Edna Walling than Edna Walling's gardens. And they were both English-born, both far ahead of their time, both absolutely extraordinary people, environment, theatre, music, just everything, just very well educated, really individual people. So it was kind of that, and then moving to a garden myself, to an old house, 1828 actually, and then thinking, okay, I want to start gardening, and so doing it, of course, because I had all the Edna Walling books, just doing it in the Edna Walling style, which gave me a big cop-out to kind of go wild, because I love wild gardens.
It's one of the true
But then
beauties.
I found out that most of her gardens, like most of the ones that are designed, are very, very formal, but they always had the wild garden to offset the formal.
Right. And Sara, I mean, that's a very personal story, Trisha. Since you were little, Edna Walling was part of your life. Yet you've played Edna Walling through most parts of her life. Do you want to give us a little bit now? I mean, I want to see some, obviously.
Do you want me to read something?
Soon. How did you come to do
what
that?
The opening line was of the play.
Oh, you have it?
I have the
Do you
opening
need
line.
the outfit? Do you need the jodhpurs?
Well, I won't got the jacket. I don't have the jodhpurs. The opening line was, I love all things most gardeners abhor. Moss in lawns, lichen on trees, more greenery than colour, as if green isn't a colour, and so on.
So she had you from the very first line of the role.
Yes, I had the audience. I mean, they were there, and we were outside. My entrance was through a wonderful colonnade of trees in the Fitzroy Gardens. It was a movable feast, or a movable picnic, literally. We were in 5 different sections of the gardens. So we did 5 sections of Edna's life in these different places. So everyone had to get up and move. And we had to. I wheeled a wheelbarrow through that play. I got fit. I can tell you, Edna Walling was very, very fit. She was very, very strong for a small frame. And boy, did I learn, that wheelbarrows can be heavy if you've got a lot in them. So I experienced her energy and vitality and aspects of her life. And she came from Devon. Now, I'm a Devonshire dumpling. I was born in Devon, and I saw the places she saw. When she went on the steam train up to Dartmoor and walked with her father, and he said, how far do you think that tour is from here? What's the measurement? What's the depth of that? How high is that dry stone wall? I knew what she was looking at, because I had been there as a child, not doing that, just wandering around, daydreaming. But I knew the feel of it, the springiness of the grass, the bogginess, that sweet boggy smell, the tussocks, the tors. We used to go there every summer holiday, camping in an army tent that leaked. Because my mother came from there, and the ruins near Fogintor, which is where we always used to go, were where my great-grandparents used to live. And so there was this great depth of understanding where she'd come from, the landscape that really she had in her heart, and that she lost. She was wrenched out of it like a sapling, and half her roots stayed there. And I understood it.
And you fell for her writing as well, didn't you, from an early start, as a writer yourself? I mean, you described to us when we were speaking the other day that you get excited every time you read it.
Well, preparing for this, I started reading things out loud, which is a great way of feeling them. And as soon as I start reading her work, there's this great energy. I learned how to do her by reading her, because people said, who knew her, she wrote like she spoke. Yeah. And I'm sure that's true. So I feel, even though she had quite a baritone voice, and I haven't, but it's the tone, it's the nuance, it's the wry irony, it's the charm and the cheekiness. It's all there. And the play reproduced much of her own work. So I was speaking her words in her voice as far as I could, wheeling that wheelbarrow.
Really? I've done a lot of talking wheeling a wheelbarrow myself. I know it can be tough.
Yeah.
But Trisha, you went on from perhaps like a really personal story of understanding garden design, living in good gardens and being a gardener, to research and really delve deep into that design work of Edna's, writing these books. Tell me, really, what do you think that it is that we're all sitting here now? Obviously, it's the wheelbarrow pushing baritone of opinions and life that we love, but also this work is something special, isn't it?
It is something special. You've only got to look at these plans. Glenn Wilson, who worked with Edna Walling for quite a while, and he just said that she made landscape drawing into an art form, like a beautiful musical score. They're really beautiful, and there's no one in the world. I looked at Gertrude Jekyll's plans, I looked at Beatrix Ferran's plans, the two best kind of known designers in the world, and their plans, nothing. There's no one in Australia. There's no plans, no landscape plans are going to come to that. So that's one thing. Her photography is just, this book, and you'll see the photos over there, they're just absolutely beautiful. They're really up there with Dupain and Casno. Very, very, very atmospheric and, totally eschewed colour photography. So it was all the raking light and backlight and everything, but they're really artistic. Her writing that we were just talking about, it was like her garden plantings, that she just used simple words, so she didn't try and kind of gild the lily in the garden with really exotic plants. She really didn't purposefully use variegated plants or plants that stopped you in your things. It was very, very simple plants like quince plants and lilacs, and just the simplest of the simplest. And the same with her words. She wasn't too wordy. It was just so engaging.
Can you describe her gardens really changing the way
totally.
we were building gardens in Australia?
Yeah, so when she burst onto the scene, gardens back in the 1920s were look-at-me gardens, and there were literally so many of them would even have a map of Australia in the front lawn, and they'd be edged with zinnias and then marigolds in the middle. And it was so when you walk down the street, you had to have the most kind of look-at-me garden. And so she totally changed that to have gardens where you'd lie on the chamomile lawn or you'd be under the leafy pergola, and they're gardens to live in, and they were just really gardens to explore. And always, it didn't matter if it was the tiniest town garden, there'd be rooms in that garden, so there's no way you would see it all at once. And even in the huge big country gardens, the pergola would be way, way, way out, so you had to discover the whole garden to find that pergola, or there's a hazelnut walk right at the end of a garden that you had to discover that. So it was all about discovery and the mystery of gardens.
And I feel like it's something that we talk about so much today still with design, is to, and with people in general, or with municipal design, is to try and engage people with their outdoor environment,
That's
to live
right.
in it and not look at it. I talk to designers all the time about more and more, and even, my role working for a program where we present gardens, really we're more interested in the ones people use and live in and make themselves over decades necessarily. They're more interesting in lots of ways than the ones that are just made to look out a window at.
And I mean, even now, there's King Charles saying a lawn should not be a monoculture, and and everything's all about wilding and wild, and it's really, really interesting that. But I think most of all with her design, she understood space better than anyone I know, and it's all about space. And there's a Chinese philosophy that says the area of space is more important than what's actually been painted. But it was all about areas of space, and so they were very architectural gardens. She was, I think, she probably was as much kind of an architect, and she'd often go into gardens and she'd say, oh, I wish we could just move the house that way. And then she really loved houses that were really one room thick, like in France. And even I have an 1828 house, and it's around a courtyard, so everywhere every house, every room in the house, you're looking out. And that's what she wanted, to be able to look out into greenery, into just leafy pergolas and things. But it's her pergolas that are the most amazing things, just the generosity of her scale of everything.
Amazing. And that is all about space too. And
Yes.
I love that you've solved that for me. It's pergola, not pergola. Yeah. But it's, it is, I look at that and I think about the way we put people into different categories. You're a garden designer, or you're a landscaper, or you're a painter, or you're an artist. And I commonly say to people, creativity is something that anyone can express and can have. And so when you see the work of someone like Edna, she's clearly just a creative person, and we're lucky she fell into gardens, really. Totally. She could have done so many things. But, she's not a fully formed designer the day she arrives on the shores. You say she was wrenched out of the roots of home. Where did Edna actually come from, do you think, as a young person? And what were some of the influences on her?
That's a good question, Millie. She went to New Zealand. The family went to New Zealand initially because they were seeking a new life. One of the tragedies that happened in Plymouth, where Edna grew up, was that their shop burnt down. They used to live over the shop. It was an ironmonger's shop, and it was full of tools, which Edna loved to play with. She liked to hammer and saw, not a needle and thread. And this was, I think, the initial influence. Fancy being a child or a baby crawling amongst all these tools and being used to it. You'd be in heaven, wouldn't you?
I definitely do.
Yeah.
It resonates with me.
Yeah.
In a painful way at times.
Oh, but so would I. She was a tomboy, I was a tomboy. I loved all those things too. But she went against the feminine stereotype always. And I think that's not an influence, that's internal.
Yeah.
Either you got that or you haven't. So that's what she grew up with. She always said she was a misfit, she was odd. She never fitted into that stereotypical feminine mould, that box. What she did was break the box and make a huge circle of her own playtime, her own individuality. So I think she just was in many ways, but to have been taken out of home when she didn't want to leave, she left her friends, she left a school she really liked, and she really liked the French nuns who were teaching her all sorts of things about hand, heart, and head. They taught the whole girl, so they accepted her practicality. She was really good at art and geometry. Go figure.
And her family accepted it too. Her father encouraged the skills that she had.
They were both brilliant. They saw her as she was and accepted it and encouraged it, which was most unusual for Edwardian times. Then, really strangely, they ended up in Christchurch, and she obviously said, I don't want to be here. I'm going to go out and work as a sort of glorified domestic on a sheep property. And she did that for a year. She cooked. This is so unlike Edna.
I do recall that she was highly awarded in the preserving fruit category at Burnley Horticultural College. And I would say you can be a cook and not necessarily be a feminine woman.
Yes, but she got those top marks because she knew how to solder the tins.
Oh, I love it.
She was very good at metalwork.
I have.
Very good at metalwork. She's made
to
some
learn to
wonderful
weld.
things, which I've only discovered recently. Which is fabulous. So I think she may have wanted to be a farmer at one point, and that may have been the attraction. I think she may have thought she'd be riding a horse and, looking after the sheep, but she ended up in the kitchen looking after the
And
farmer.
eventually she did end up in Melbourne and at Burnley Horticultural College.
Yes, she
And
tried
this is
a bit of
amazing
nursing.
photograph.
She tried a bit of nursing, got hauled out of that by her father.
Disconsolate.
He said, "You must have the outdoor life." He knew her. And her mother said, "Come with me. There's this school called the Burnley School of Horticulture. I think it might work." And Edna says, I never thought of gardening. She liked to shape earth. She liked to landscape with earth. But Burnley was the place that kicked her off, and that was it.
That was it. And Trisha, I mean, as a garden designer, we think of her as, I often hear her designs described as English cottage style. And I find that a bit uncomfortable because we're not in England.
No.
And she was
And she-
using some of those plants,
But
but
she said if we want to garden the Australian way, we have to learn from the landscape. So what she wasn't a purist that we had to have Indigenous plants, but to learn the way that they actually grew in the thing. And that's why, the potatoes, throwing the potatoes, because she hated things and regimented.
so throwing the potatoes
So-
was her method for planting bulbs.
Anything, but it was for trees, it was for
anything.
seeds or anything. And if anyone knows Elizabeth von Arnhem, who's amazing writer, ended up in Prussia and Nassenheide, but again, the Prussian gardeners would plant everything in rows, and she'd kind of go and do whatever. And so Edna Walling, learning from the Australian landscape right at the beginning, not like Gordon Ford, they didn't necessarily have to have just all native plants, but to learn the way that they actually grew the ground cover. So she'd have time and along with a lot of the native plants, but learning our landscape. I think as she learnt the landscape of Devon back then, she learnt the Australian landscape. But it's really interesting. There's a beautiful photograph. You won't really be able to see it, but it's a photo of young Edna when she arrived in Melbourne, and at the time, and
She looked so dark about it.
so disconsolate, bored, and she had no idea what she wanted to be. And it was literally
Yeah, that's it.
that
It's a
one.
great
Just
photo.
look it up.
She's just
I mean,
like,
it's just brilliant. But that's why her mother kind of dragged her off and said to the principal of Burnley, Edna loves gardens, and she's kind of sitting there thinking, I don't. Anyhow, it wasn't until she saw a dry stone wall that changed everything. It was the architecture, it was that, and that's what her gardens just became, just so strongly architectural, and just that's why they've survived all those years. You think that not many gardens are ephemeral and they disappear when the creator goes, but hers, because they had that really strong architectural framework, they have survived.
it's so true. And you come to probably, if I had a little collection of Edna Walling dolls, some people got Barbies, I probably would have liked Action Edna. For me, when I think about her, I think I read a quote, did I? Yes, I did. So I was reading Esme Johnson's sort of story about Edna, and I read her say, she said, and she used to call Edna the stormy petrel, the bird, which I thought was just one of the best nicknames I've ever heard. And if anyone wants to call me the stormy petrel, go for it. There's no such word as can't in Edna's lexicon.
Yeah.
The birth of an idea called for immediate action, no hesitation, and no doubts about the outcome. And I love that. She wasn't a gardener, and then suddenly she worked hard, and she physically worked, and she was...
Because there's one story when her first country garden was Wairiri up at Mansfield, and I met the Mrs. Weatherly from Wollongoon, who grew up as a young child, as a Forster Rutledge young child, trailing after Edna Walling in the garden. And her story was that Edna Walling would be literally in the jodhpurs, the hat, the cropped hair, and working physically. She built every single stone wall there. She did every path. She did every single thing there. But then at night she'd actually have the little black velvet number with the lace collar, and so she actually knew how to fit in with the very kind of well-to-do people that she was staying with while she did that. And it's kind of lovely, that enigma, that she was could fit in both things, which obviously she must have, because she certainly designed for the rich and the famous, didn't she?
It's true, but she did the work herself. I mean, I mentioned it in the introduction, and I don't think until we were speaking and I was rereading Sara's book, which I read 15 years ago. I read this biography of Edna Walling, this person I'd heard about in my periphery. I didn't go to Burnley Horticultural College, I went to TAFE. And I read this book and I just couldn't believe this person had existed in my world, admittedly before I was thinking about gardening, who was such a person of action, and who at the age of 26 had taken it upon themselves to hand build their own house. I mean, talk about that, Sara. Like, you delved right into her life writing this biography.
Yeah.
Like, how does that even happen?
Well, she puts it, she went for a bushwalk, as she did a lot, because she loved the Australian countryside. She came across a for sale sign at Murdoch, and long story short, she bought a plot.
Which was countryside then, wasn't it?
Oh, it was
farming
actually
land.
it was a cow paddock. It had a few native trees, but it was overworked agriculturally. And it sat there for a while, and she was very busy, but Margaret Walling, her mother, said, are you going to do something about that? I know you wanted to build a cottage. What's happening? And Margaret actually went out there and said, it's very nice, and that there are lots of stones around you could use for building. So she sort of teased Edna back into thinking about it, because it was so expensive. She'd spent all her dough on the plot. She thought someone was going to build it for her.
So she's working as a designer by now.
She is. She's earning, but, she earns half the rate of men. Don't forget that. Girl gardeners, cheap.
Right.
So she was going to get someone else to build it. Too expensive. Okay, I'll build it myself. I'll get some books. And she studied endlessly studied books. It was marvellous. And she had her step-nephew help her, Bill, who was a schoolboy. And between them, they worked out how they could do it. They could use packing cases that her father worked for a scales company, and the very large scales came in very large wooden packages, and that was recycled. Some people used aeroplane packages, which were very large, but they were too expensive, so she had to do it on the cheap. I think she learned all about recycling then. She cut down young saplings for the beams. Unfortunately, they had, what is it that you have in wood?
Termites.
Termites and the other thing.
Probably some sort of borer. Some of the
borer,
timbers get it.
that's the word, borer.
Yeah.
So that was a problem to solve later on. And she gathered stone. She got a horse. She couldn't afford a carriage at the time, so she built a sled. You know how Native American Indians had
Easier than
sleds?
a wheelbarrow.
Yeah. So
If you've got a mule or something.
she attached this to her horse, Adam, and she'd go down and pick stuff up from the station, Murdoch station, and drag it up until she did actually get a carriage, because her father paid for one. And she built this thing piece by piece by piece herself. She wore the jodhpurs. She dispensed with the overskirt that was to be polite. She just said, oh, look, I'm working.
That was her jodhpur era. Well, it was the beginning of it.
Yeah, well, it started at Burnley. That was the uniform. But the uniform at Burnley was a polite overskirt that the women had to wear. And if you see a photo of her, I think it's in one of your books, there's a class photo, and they're all sitting there politely. But Edna's got showing thigh. You know, she just doesn't care.
I love it. I love that if you were wearing pants, you had to wear a skirt over the top.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
So dangerous on the machinery. You get caught in things.
Yes.
But her ability to bring people along, we're all probably converts to this. We're all sitting in this room. It's one of her great skills, isn't it?
Well, she just had that really engaging personality, and she talks about it, she just loved life. She just absolutely embraced it with everything. And one of her friends, just two lovely little anecdotes. One of her friends was just there, and Edna says, let's go on a bushwalk. And so she grabs a hat from the thing and she goes bang, bang, and then, well, that's the dusting done, let's go. And then another lovely one was they were going up to, at the end, when they were leaving Bickley Vale, they were going to drive up to Buderim, where they're actually going to live. And so the car was all loaded up with everything and overloaded, absolutely overloaded. And I don't know, but I live in the country, and truly the things that I come home with, it doesn't matter if it's 4 doors for an old building or whatever, I'll kind of drive the whole way back from Sydney like this just so we fit them in. Women have an ability to fit way more into a car than any.
I totally agree. Yet men will always
do.
come and try and tie things on my ute.
Yes.
Like, get your own ute, right?
So listen,
I can do the knots.
You'll just love this. So there was just so much. It was just on the top and it was on the back and it was just tied on everywhere. So then the son of the friend came along to say goodbye and said, oh, look, don't be ridiculous. You can't go off like that. You're travelling all the way to Queensland. So she just said, okay, take off what you think. And so he took it off half. Bye. As he drove out, boom, all went
Put it all
back
on. Tied a good knot and off you go.
But she and then also the other thing is she just had music going all the time. And I know I can't be without music where I am. And she'd just have Brahms symphony while she was actually designing. And it was always she just loved and lived life, just embraced it. And, she did like 200 plans in short time, like in just a few years. Like, she was very prolific and very
is that 200 gardens were built?
Yeah.
Wow.
So prodigious, incredible.
I think that, someone like that, and, it's easy to know how people would be carried along with someone that could be inspired or see excitement or see beauty and maybe show you the beauty. I mean, if she's seeing something beautiful in the landscape and you're walking in the bush with her, you're not getting away without a full explanation of why that's beautiful, right?
But then the nicest person she said she ever met was the person who said they just wanted to grow landscape. So isn't that nice?
What do you mean grow landscape?
As in just because she loved borrowed landscapes, but she wanted to have like the landscape in the garden and not have, herbaceous borders and things. She just wanted to grow landscape in her garden.
And that, I mean, of course, from Sonning came Bickley Vale. I always say it with the wrong intonation, I think. But I mean, that was an incredible step into a much wider community. I mean, the community around her building that must have been extraordinary.
Edna had the ability to attract people to her, especially women. I think she really enjoyed the company of women. She was attracted to women, and they were attracted to her. Why wouldn't you be? I'd be up there now. I'd volunteer. Can I help you build your next cottage? I'd love to, and she'd teach you how as you went along, and you'd all make mistakes and you had a good laugh. The first person that she attracted was Blanche Sharp, before she was married. She was a qualified pharmacist, and she went up with a friend to visit Edna Walling. She didn't know Edna at the time, and she happened to see Edna's desk, which was a chaotic mess of undone tax return. And her father was an accountant, a very good one. And she said, can I help you with that? So she came back the next weekend and helped her with all that. She is the most wonderful, efficient woman, Blanche Marshall. I'd have her on my team any day. Anyway, Blanche loved what Edna was doing, her ideas, her enthusiasm, and she joined her. She gave up for the time her career in pharmacy, which would have been far more lucrative. She could drive at this time, she could ride a horse, she was quite adventurous herself. Blanche, but she said, I'll come and help you, because Edna was always needing assistance. And early on in the years, they came. They just came. Later on, not so easy. She was moody and difficult, and the times were different. But Blanche was her assistant for some years. She was also engaged to Louis Marshall, and she kept postponing the wedding. She kept postponing it.
Because when she got married, she'd have to give up her job, right?
I know, she could still run her own pharmacy, but she was having such a good time. She kept a little diary. I think you might have seen it too, because we followed the same trail of research. Do you remember those really tiny ones that you could hardly write, and they used to come with a pencil that's stuck in the back? Anyway, when Blanche started with Edna, there's nothing, and the day she starts with Edna, it says, very, very happy. That's it and then you'd have Edna in a bad mood. Wonderful day. But so that's just the first. And then there was Gwyneth Crouch, the wonderful tall Gwyneth, who did go through Burnley, and Sue Forrester is here this evening, who is Gwyneth's daughter. And there's a wonderful lineage here, because Sue started Astroflora, and so it goes on, which is fabulous, because you feel Edna lives, Edna keeps living.
She was certainly an influencer. I mean, there was always people around. And I know that we've all had times in our life where you have a project. You can all get behind something and you work hard and you laugh hard and you have wonderful creative ideas together. I mean, reading some of the descriptions of building the place at Lawn, just the discovery of that beautiful rock and the excitement of really seeing that landscape as they worked to build that. I just think it's so extraordinary. But, there's no doubt she was an influencer, right? We have this word for it now. But I think Edna's influence is so strong. And I alluded to it at the start of tonight, that I see it still within my day-to-day. I feel like I have a direct line to Edna through one of my mentors, who in fact worked for her, and Sue would know Roger Elliott really, really well. And, he put an ad in the paper as a 19-year-old. He was studying chemistry and just wanted some gardening work. And guess who answered the ad in the paper? And so he went to work with Edna as a young man, and she just told him straight, you are wasted on what you're doing, you need to work with plants. And he said, well, look, you better talk to my parents about this, because that's how it was done. So she made an appointment, and she went and told his parents, you are wasted. He's wasting his time. He needs to work with plants. And she facilitating him getting a job with a really renowned landscape building company, worked with Glenn Wilson as a young man, and he went on to be, he's published 9 volumes of encyclopedia about Australian native plants, and if you thumb through any library, you'll see that. And I think that it is such a thread through Australian gardening that this person lives on through so many people and continues to inspire us. And, she was influencer at the time, wasn't she? She was working for the rich and famous, but her own life was not the rich and famous. It was the humble and hard-working.
Totally opposite. And just that's the thing, like some of her gardens interact. There's one with a double tennis court and 2 twin pergolas either side of a pool, and the visiting ballet groups from overseas would kind of dance in the garden there and everything. But she was just living really, really, really simply out there, and it was just, I think, interesting. But then she'd get in a little car and she'd drive out to, far out into the Western District, and some of those gardens out there are just totally outstanding. They are masterpieces. They're just extraordinary, and they still survive, and the people, often the same families there. And honestly, one time, I used to do tours for the Australian Garden History Society, and in fact there's someone sitting up the back, Annie Woodhouse, Woodside, who's here, and the first Edna Walling, or one of the Edna Walling tours anyhow, there she was sitting waiting for the bus. She actually lived in Sonning, which is really amazing. But we would go to all Edna Walling's gardens, and the first one we'd go to all the Edna Walling gardens in spring, and it was all lovely and it was beautiful, but it was so booked out we actually did an autumn one, which was way better, because in autumn people then looked at the design of the garden, and I love visiting her gardens in winter because there is such good design. But it's so interesting that there's still so many of her gardens that survive. It's just extraordinary, and are so beloved and are so well looked after. It's like having a beautiful masterpiece, and that's why the plans, I spent so long here when I was working on especially this book of her plans, because there'd never been a book in Australia of garden plans, and so no publisher really wants to take it on. But so I just spent so long here in Latrobe looking through all her plans, and I thought, honestly, every single person, everyone that's interested in gardening can learn so much about space, about plants, about everything by just studying her plans. And that's why we did that book. But it's just so lovely, this repository here, and just the care and the dedication and just what you wonderful women were talking about, the way you actually preserving everything. It's just so good.
I think it's actually really exciting in a contemporary way for me. I think we need to read a bit of her writing, because as an influencer, I mean, listening to the way she writes, it's like, dear reader, you are right here with me in my garden. I'm a private person, but you get to come in my back gate every single month and read. And you've picked something, Sara, that you think takes us down the path.
Yes, there's two. I've got two pieces that I'd love to read the second as well, because that's also about gardening. This is more a personal thing. This is one of her letters to garden lovers, which was a regular column. This is September 1942, so note it's during the Second War. My dear gardeners, I wish I didn't get so excited. I just went over to the potting shed to take some seeds over or something, and now I'm all of a heap. All I want to do is rush and put on some Chopin, some Tchaikovsky, ballet music, anything that fits this mood. Or do handsprings on the lawn, turn Catherine wheels off the piazza. That would make the locals sit up and take notice. Or tear over and tell the mistress of Linton Lee that the white Daphne is out.
I get it! Who doesn't understand that excitement as a gardener? Like, that is the most apt description of a germinating seed. Yeah. You can do cartwheels.
But look at the construction of that.
It's incredible.
And also,
ta-da!
Exactly. So please go back to what you're going to do. But can I just say that's why her books just kept on going, because I've looked at other books that were, say, written in the 40s and 50s, and they're just these really kind of dull books with colour photographs that are so kind of and there's just nothing. It's just
there's still plenty of that around,
yeah,
Trisha.
But that was a particularly bad time for garden books.
Yes.
But you look at hers, that people that went into, and people that have their first edition, second editions, third editions, whatever, they're just poetic books. They're just absolutely beautiful.
Wonderful. And it wasn't just, she redrafted and redrafted. Yeah. I'm sure you've seen, the notes, the scribble. So it wasn't off the top of their head.
It wasn't just that writing. She was like writing books. She was writing, letters to the paper, protests against the quarry. She would write protests against the slaughter of historic trees. She was a prolific communicator, and she understood the power of the word. It's something that I really understood when I read that she was talking about how upsetting, or how it was a total disgrace that we'd labelled the tea tree as scrub. Mm. And it was one of the biggest mistakes we made, because, and I worked for a national television, show. We think about these things. If you can change the way people feel about scrub and its value, and I can tell you, we've done salt marshes, we've done bogs, we've done all of these things that get these really negative names, and therefore people don't value them. And just trying to really, she understood the power of the language she was using to grow the value that people saw in different landscapes.
But then they didn't listen to her. The rest of her life, like the last bit of her life, wasn't it just tragic? Because books were sent back and articles were sent back. They were unpublished and just...
People didn't buy this in the same
the
way. I
Australian
noticed it doesn't
roadside.
even have her name on the spine. And Roger Elliott said to me, she was always trying to give it to me. She had boxes of them. And I never got one. And so I had to buy one second hand in the end.
But that's the Australian roadside. You know, at the very end it says, the roadside is the front garden of the nation. And I mean, so important. We were talking earlier that literally most of the endemic flora is actually on roadsides or in old cemeteries or in travelling stock reserves.
Yeah, and she saw that in 1952, that's published.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that's the thing that for me, I feel that her voice is one that you could literally harness today to try and send those same messages out that many of us are screaming from the mountaintops.
But the biggest one is, and sorry, we've got to get back to your Sarah, sorry.
You've got to read something, I'm excited.
Is water, because water, that's what our next wars are going to be about. Water is so precious, and she would have people to stay. She didn't water. She had people to stay, and they'd kind of jump up and think they're helping by watering. She'd think, oh God, I'm going to have to just wean those plants off water for the next thing. She's inspired me so much with her water consciousness, because that's, if anyone saw Gérard Depardieu in Manon de Sauce and Jean de Florette, that's about early water wars over in France. It's such a big issue that we still don't get. I think she was way ahead of her time with that.
I think you're right. And Trisha and I came together to talk about coming to do this, and independently both really wanted to highlight her work with Australian plants, with conservation, with that awareness that she grew very quickly in her practice.
Before, yeah.
Do you want to read now, or do you want to read?
I want to read something
Yes.
now. I want to say, just going back to influencer, I just want to say, there's a filmmaker here this evening, Sam Iclo, who has recently got some funding towards making a fictional feature film based on my biography.
Can't wait.
From Screen New South Wales. So all these things may possibly be for another generation.
Wonderful.
And as I laughed with you, that if you do make that film, Sam, that will be very helpful when I dress as Edna Walling for a fancy dress party. Next time, I won't spend all night explaining my outfit to everyone in the room. I've still got it in a box somewhere.
I want to see it.
Please read.
Here, just this is from
We should have dressed as
Gardener's
her tonight.
Log, published in 1948. Lots of segments that she wrote. The treeless garden. How dull a treeless garden can be. I shall never forget one client. I want you to get me 6 choice shrubs, he said pompously. Whatever for? I said, chafing at the confusion of my profession with that of a nurseryman. Not that I wouldn't as soon be a nurseryman. Both have equal disadvantages, I should think. To plant in my garden, of course, he said snappily. What? Without some trees to go with them? Trees grow too big, he said. They don't take up as much room as shrubs, said I. And once again, I had to explain this little thing. And before I'd finished, he had decided, being a man of action, to have all trees and no shrubs. What? No shrubs, I said. And then I had to explain that I needed some shrubs to make a picture. His energy was fading. Oh, do as you like, he said, throwing up his hands. I made a few rough notes and hurried off to get I've forgotten what it was now, but it was a very deserving case.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, that's just so fantastic. I think we need to release. Are you ready over there? Do we have security? I think we need to release the crowd to go and have a little look at the wonderful collection that's on display. But before we do that, I know we've all been thinking about it over the last few weeks and sending little messages back and forth and discussing all these little things that pop into your mind. And Trisha, it's funny because I hadn't told you I was going to ask you this question, but you'd been thinking about it. You said, if you meet all right, so time machine, either we're going back or she's coming here, you can choose.
Yeah.
What would you ask Edna if you got to meet her?
I got up very early this morning. I live way up in the foothills of the Snowy Mountains, and anyhow, I ended up in Melbourne, got up at 5 o'clock this morning, so a long kind of time for thinking. And I was thinking, what would I ask? Because you've written so amazingly about her, the person. We've kind of done a lot about the plans. There's so much about her and her design and everything. So we kind of know it. I mean, we don't know her, but we kind of know it. So I thought, what would I... But there's two little questions. Just that one, her pergolas that I talked about before, there's even one garden in Tasmania that she did. It was her biggest plan, and it's actually the blueprint here in the library, and Green Acres it was, and it actually now split up into about 8 gardens and homes, but the pergola goes over 2 gardens, so you can actually walk in here. I think there's a fence there, but it's literally, her pergolas were like no others that I've ever seen. They were always wide and they were low and big columns, tiny little overhead things. And it was so interesting because at Budderam, at Budderam...
You're realising you're now fangirling Edna and you haven't asked her the question yet.
No, so I'm going to ask her.
I've had this experience.
Okay, so I have to ask, so I wanted to ask her where she got the inspiration for those pergolas, because the Capuchin convent over on the Amalfi, there's the most amazing one, and that's exactly her pergolas, but she never went there. So I want to ask her, did she go there? But then I was just reading, either in your book or mine, that she didn't actually, she didn't ever travel. She never left Australia.
Right.
So she didn't go over there.
But she was a great consumer of books, of music, of art.
But the sad thing is, she did these incredible pergolas. Where did she kind of get that inspiration from? Because they are amazing. They are the most extraordinary features. But speaking to my daughter-in-law this morning, who's just been staying with her mother in Budderam, and she said, what about that Edna Walling Memorial Garden? And I said, yes. So the Edna Walling Memorial Garden in Budderam, they've got this pergola that's skinny. She said she hates those daddy long legs, tall, skinny things. But not only is it skinny, it
Would
turns
your question
corners.
be, do you want us to try and petition to get it taken down?
It turns corners. Like, you can't have an Edna Walling...
Can do, Edna. If anyone has an apparition tonight...
And so a beautiful... tell them just that you could actually rebuild it as a proper one of hers.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Sarah, what would you...
I would ask her one more little question. That did she ever meet Gertrude Jekyll?
Oh,
because
yes,
she was
of
so
course.
influenced by Jekyll.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes. No, that's a good question. And
She didn't.
No, I don't think she did.
Asked and answered. That's what we do here. Sarah, what would you ask Edna if you got to see her?
Edna, would you come to dinner with me?
Ask her out on a date. I love it. I feel like I would do the same. I'd say, do you want to go for a walk, like a bushwalk somewhere, or just quietly walk and tell me whatever it is you want to tell me?
Yeah.
I mean, the shared experience.
And just listen to her.
But that's it. I mean, this is the thing that we read from all of the people who knew her and all of those people who've been influenced by her, and all of us sharing some time tonight thinking about her, that shared experience that she brought to thinking about the landscape, loving the process of making and doing and breaking and redoing. I mean, I feel like she learnt lessons well. I just think she is such an inspiration. Well, we're gonna wrap up. I'm going to thank you both so much for tonight. Please thank both Sarah and Trisha.
Thank you, Sarah.
And a big thanks as well to Marika and Sarah for taking time.
And to Millie. Millie.
Yes, thank you, Millie.
Oh,
Thank you, Millie.
and also all of the library staff, including our wonderful sound. I'm sorry, I'm a bit loud on a microphone. But all of the wonderful staff who've come to help. But they're all here to answer questions and to explain some of the work they do here. Come and say hello. We're going to stick around. They'll start flicking the lights on and off at some point, and they will eventually kick us out. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Edna.
Thank you,
What
Edna.
an icon.